Hello and welcome to another episode of the Untold. Now, off screen, we have a chair that is going to be hosting a brilliant guest for today. But before that, I'm your host, Abdullah AlHendyani. I'm joined by my colleague.
Lujain AlAtheri. And today we have with us Dr. Ayesha Kamal, who is a grief counselor and a psychotherapist. And she helps people deal with their emotions, their grief, and their healing, which I think is a really beautiful path to follow.
Yeah, honestly, for today's episode, I'm really excited to sit down and talk about, grief, our emotions, and be openly, and publicly discussing the human behavior, in general, because it's a topic that's not spoken a lot. It's not, being shared among people, even between friends, families. You always see people who kind of, just stomp on their feelings and move on.
I agree. It's not spoken about enough at all, and a lot of people deal with their emotions in different ways, and I'm curious to see what she has to say about how she helps people to deal with all the different emotions, especially grief that they feel in their everyday lives.
Yeah, in terms of grief, it's such a universal kind of language, right? Our emotions is what connects us. You can be all over the globe, you're going to be having the same kind of emotions, right? Sadness is sadness, happiness is happiness, wherever you are in the world. So I'm really happy to sit down with Dr. Aisha and to talk about the intricacies of such feelings, right? To define these feelings, to put them in simple terms so that whenever we have them, we know what we have and we can talk openly about them.
I agree. I think it's something that will help a lot of people because, as you said, it's not spoken about enough. And I think a lot of people need to understand that grief is a universal concept and it's individual to the person who feels it. And so are all emotions, really. And with that, I think we should just dive into our episode. So stay tuned for after the break.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, on The Untold. But first and most importantly, welcome Dr. Aisha Kamal for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's wonderful to have you. You're both a psychotherapist and a grief counselor, is that correct?
That is correct.
Before we dive in, could you explain more what exactly psychotherapy is?
Sure. Psychotherapy is the field of studying how the mind works, to put it very briefly. And in terms of the work that we do, it's about having people come in and figure out why do they feel the way they feel, why do they do the things they do, and really get to the root of their life, really.
I feel like that's an awesome field to be in because that's something a lot of people deal with all the time and no one knows how their minds or emotion work. So thank you for doing that.
It's my pleasure. It's such a passion.
That's so great.
Yeah, honestly, when I got the brief on you, it says grief educator. That was I was so excited to have this episode because I think grief as a topic is not being discussed, openly
Mhm.
in public at least, or even in privately between family members and everything, right? Not a lot of people are okay or comfortable talking about grief. So I was really excited to sit down with you and talk about that point in specific.
Well, it's actually something that's relatively new for me. I mean, I'm not a stranger to grief itself, but this grief educator certification that I did and the training that I've been through over the past year and a half has really opened my eyes to not just the experience, but how prevalent it is. For it's a universal experience. And so that's what made it very important for me to really focus on that. And I also noticed that everyone who comes into my office, no matter what they're talking about, it seems that at the root of their emotions is some sort of loss. And it doesn't have to be a death, but it's a loss of something. And they're grieving. So I wanted to delve a bit more into that and then see how can we unearth this grief without it being re-traumatizing almost? How do you talk about sadness without feeling too sad? It's quite challenging.
So is that what inspired you to pursue this career?
For psychotherapy, I've always been interested in just human behavior and how emotions and our minds work. For grief, it was, I think, this personal experience of my own, and then also seeing that it's a continuous trend. Almost everybody who comes into my office is experiencing some sort of grief. So I wanted to focus on that and see how can we heal from that, and also how can we create spaces where we actually have this conversation. As you said, it's everyone may be grieving in some way or grieving some sort of loss, but we don't talk about it. So how can we feel brave enough and safe enough to talk about it?
Yeah. And has there been, I know you've mentioned it briefly that, there's something that happened that you kind of pursued this kind of line of work. So has there been a personal experience or moment that really deepened your understanding of grief or the process of it?
A very personal moment,
Oh,
actually. In 2017, I lost my younger brother,
oh,
and he had cancer, and he was doing really well. And like he wasn't doing well, and then he was, and we were very hopeful, and then suddenly he was gone.
oh,
And when we think about the natural trajectory of life, we kind of know that our grandparents will pass away, and then we think that, okay, then it'll be our parents, and then we have this idea that death will work a certain way. But real life doesn't work that way. So I felt my life was just turned upside down. And it was very interesting being the sister who lost her brother, because it wasn't just a sibling who was grieving, it was my parents who were grieving. So I had to watch them go through that. And at that point, I was not thinking academically at all. It was pure emotion, pure survival. But now, years later, in fact, and it has taken me years to grieve and get to this place where I can talk about it without, I feel the emotions, but maybe
yeah.
without it interfering, with me talking about it. Like, I want to express that, yes, I have grieved, I have lost, and I'm still here, and I can talk about it now.
And
Well, first of all, I want to say I'm so sorry for your loss. That's something that's so difficult to deal with. Like you said, we kind of expect our grandparents or older people to pass away, as is the trajectory of life. But when it's something more unexpected, especially when it's someone young, it's kind of hits you, I think, in a very different way because it's not something you've been equipped to deal with. So, has this experience helped you to deal with your own clients' issues as well?
I believe so. It's a fine balance between my own grief and theirs. Like, I have to find that dividing line, because in the end, when they're in my office, it's not about me. But it definitely allows me to empathize with them a lot more and understand, because my grieving process was my own. So it's very personal. And when they tell me that, let's say their family members don't understand what they're going through, even though they have also experienced loss, like, oh, yes, I can relate to that. Or they don't know how to express their emotions. I have my own techniques that have worked for me, and I give them as suggestions because, again, it's not that one size fits all. We have to be open to exploring what works for us. And that's a big unknown, and unknowns are always scary. So my role, as I see it, is more to provide them with a bit of security that they can feel when they're with me so that they can explore what's going to work for them to help them feel better.
and how would you define grief? Because I know it's such a broad term,
hmm
and a lot of people would say, "Oh, grief, that's just, being unhappy, hazin." So how would you actually put it into words?
I would define grief as our emotional and physical reaction to loss.
Yeah.
Just very simply, that is our reaction to loss.
Do you think people have misconceptions about what grief is?
I think so. First of all, I think the big misconception would be that it's only related to death, but we can experience so many types of loss that we can grieve. The loss of relationships, so that could be the end of a marriage, it could be the end of a friendship. So it doesn't always have to be a significant other in a romantic sense, let's say. It could be the end of a phase of life, as you're getting older and you lose your youth. You could grieve your youth. Moving countries, I mean, almost anything that you feel like you've lost, that can be grieved.
Yeah. And honestly, this reminds me of something that I was reading about. It comes to Beethoven, out of all people. So the final composition he made, I think it was called Symphony Number 9. He actually made it because of grief for losing his hearing. So by the time he did finish the musical piece, he was completely deaf. But he used that loss, he used that grief to make his composition. And this just goes to your point, is that loss is not just about death. It's about losing something. It's about losing someone, losing something valuable to you. It could be anything.
Mhm. Yeah. And how profound is that? Like, it's something musical and he lost his hearing. So how do you kind of reconcile something that's so much central to your identity? And so you have to find a way to grieve that. It's really beautiful.
I agree. And I love how you're saying that there's so many different types of grief, because I really think people are not aware of that. But even as you were talking, I was remembering some of my own things that happened to me that were not deaths, but were huge losses in my life or huge changes that I was grieving without even realizing I was grieving at the time.
Right.
Especially, I think sometimes your mind can be in denial about things, whereas your heart wants to feel things no matter what. And I think that's something a lot of people struggle to merge together or to even be aware of. So how do you help clients who are trying to come to terms with different types of loss?
That's such a good question, because it is a very personal one. And just going back to the misconceptions, one of the misconceptions is that grief is linear. I think many people have heard about the stages of grief, that they're 5, they're actually 6 now. And the person who co-wrote that book is actually my mentor for the grief educator. The main thing is that these are not discrete stages. They can happen in any order. They don't all have to happen. But the other misconception is that we get over grief, but that's not actually true. We learn how to live with grief. So I think we want to go back to looking at this specifically, that how can you continue to live while grieving instead of thinking that, how do I stuff this sadness down? Because let me tell you that if you stuff emotions down, they will come up some way or another.
And how do you get people to talk openly about this? Because for some reason there's a stigma that, talking about grief means you're weak. I think when it comes to men and, in general. So how do you get clients or people to openly talk about grief, to openly talk about their weaknesses and everything?
This kind of is related to your question as well. It's about going at their pace. Really being very, very patient with them and giving them that space. Because sometimes especially if, let's say, there's a death in a family, everyone is going to grieve in their own way. But some people have reactions that don't sit well with others. For example, if I tell people that even after all these years, I'm still grieving my brother, they would ask me, still? Like, you're not over it yet? And that's really difficult to hear. I mean, now I know how to deal with those things, but when you're especially in the middle or in the early stages of grief, it's hard to know how to respond to those questions. So when I try and connect with my patients or my clients, it's about giving them that space, letting them express themselves however they want, and not just space, but going at their pace as well. When they're ready to talk about it, they can talk about it. So just because they've lost someone or they've lost something in their life and I know that, and they come to speak with me, it doesn't mean that that's the main thing we're going to talk about. It's whatever is on their mind. And I believe that when you feel safe, that's when you're going to start to share. And it's not just safe with me, it's safe within themselves. That I know that if I cry, it's okay. I'm not going to have my own inner critic come out and say, don't cry, that's weak, you shouldn't do that. And to just allow themselves to express themselves however they want.
That's really beautiful. And I love that you're using such an individualized approach because, as you said, grief is such a unique experience. And so therefore, everyone reacts to it differently. Like I have one friend who, when confronted with something really sad, she just starts laughing. And people get really offended by it, but that's just how she reacts to it. It's how her body reacts. But it's not meant to show any disrespect or anything like that.
Right.
And I feel like a lot of different people suffer in different ways. And we're only focused on it has to be linear. It has to be this happened at this time, should be over it by this time. And if it's not a death, then why do you care so much? But everyone experiences things differently.
Right. So I recently actually held my first grief group, and that was a very interesting experience because, first of all, the age range, I think the youngest was about 20 and the oldest was in her mid-60s, and everyone had different types of grief, different losses, and they experienced them in different ways, expressed them in different ways, but it was wonderful. It's hard to say it's wonderful when I know that it's loss that brought us all together, but it was wonderful to see them open up and be vulnerable and notice how grief affects everybody. So we can sit in silence, but it's almost like trying to sweep it under the rug. But when you sweep things under a rug, there's a big lump there. So we want to kind of expose it in a very gentle, caring way to say that, okay, you can talk about it and you will be fine.
Yeah, and I think that really highlights the point is that us, people in general, we are a society, we are a community. And I think somewhere along the lines, talking openly about feelings has become a stigma. But that's our, nature is to talk with each other, to open with each other, to share our feelings. With that being said, we are going to go on a very quick break and we'll come right back after this one.
Welcome back from that break. Dr. Ayesha, we were talking about grief and how individualized it is and how there's different types of grief, where it's not just death, which is the biggest form of grief I think we can feel, but it can be something emotional. It can be a loss, a divorce, losing a friendship, moving countries, losing a job. It's so varied because human beings are such varied creatures, not one size fits all. And you were talking about your grief group, and I think the idea of a sense of community is really, really important when it comes to grieving individuals. So how do you think it helps people to have community?
One of the things that I asked all the participants before they left was, how did this feel for you? Or what did you get out of this experience? And the two most common responses were relief and validation. And I think these are the two big things that, again, even if we know that everyone has experienced some sort of loss, until we hear it, we kind of feel alone, that I'm the only one who's carrying this burden. And just hearing that there are other people who are experiencing grief, even if it's for something different, that validation, I think, is priceless, right? And then the relief that they are not alone.
And how would healing be, right? Because I know we've talking about, grief and the journey to get better. So how would someone go on a healing journey? Like, is it moving on? Is it dealing with it? Is it facing it? It's definitely not ignoring it. So how would healing look like?
Can I play psychotherapist for a moment?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
What do the two of you do to help yourselves feel better when you're feeling down?
I think it depends. If it's something little, I might just like try to distract myself by watching a show or reading a book. Maybe journaling helps me a lot. It helps me to remove things from my mind and put it on paper. Otherwise, I guess talking to my friends helps me. But then there are some things I feel like I can't talk to my friends about. And that's, I think, where the journaling comes in for me. But there are moments where, because I feel like my emotions are so big and I have so much to do because we live in a very busy kind of world, that I put it to the side. And I keep pushing it away because I feel like it's not that important right now. I'll deal with it when I can, until it becomes, as you said, the lump that has grown. And sometimes, all the time, that ends up being something that affects me physically. Like it can affect my health and other stuff. It happened once where I was dealing with some kind of loss, and I did not deal with it at all, to the point that I ended up with a really large, like, kind of cyst on my back that got infected. It was really bad. When I went to the doctor and he removed it, I just started crying. And it wasn't from pain or anything. I was feeling grief. And I didn't understand why, because it had no relation to this situation, at least in my eyes. And then it was much later on that I realized I was grieving the loss of something that had happened in the previous months. I just had pushed it away, and so it became something my body forced me to confront. So that's for me personally. How about you, Abdullah?
I mean, I'm obviously going to be following the stigma here. I just lock myself and watch movies until everything goes away. I'm a very moody kind of eater and watcher, so I just lock myself away from people. Just indulge in movies, food, until everything just settles down.
And I would say, again, whatever you choose to do for a certain period of time is absolutely okay. If you came to me and said that, oh, I experienced loss, but I don't want to talk about it, and I said, no, you must talk about it, you're not going to like me very much. And you're definitely not going to open up, right? So it's about saying, okay, you don't need to talk about it. You can watch your movies, and you can eat, and you can journal, and whatever you need to do in that moment. But we want to make sure that we're not doing things that are actually harming us in the long run. So distraction is great, particularly now with social media, and people are like, yeah, I'm getting over it because I've been scrolling for 3 hours. That's another episode, I think, about how we can deal with that. But in terms of healing itself, I think the ultimate goal is to get to the point where you can talk about your loss and even feel your feelings, but it doesn't interrupt your life. It doesn't interrupt your daily routine to the point where it's affecting other areas. So you can isolate, that's fine. But if you isolate for so long, or to the extent where your family members can no longer approach you, or your friends can't even talk to you, then that's something that you want to kind of check. Again, there's no right or wrong way to grieve, but I would say there are healthy and unhealthy ways to grieve.
So what would you say are the healthy or unhealthy ways? Or how would you help clients dealing when they don't want to deal with it in the initial stages to get to the point where they can deal with it?
Well, my first step is also journaling. I'm an avid
Big on
journaler,
journaling too.
and I'm also a journal coach. So that's something that because of my grief, which is literally when I finally had time to myself because I was so busy caring for my parents, I wrote, no exaggeration, for years. I just filled notebook after notebook, and I found that to be very cathartic. And then I went into that line as well to see how writing can heal us. I think it's about finding ways where they can make that personal connection. So sometimes people have rituals. Sometimes people don't want to remember, and that's okay as well. But it's about doing that consciously, like saying that I understand, really acknowledging that I have this loss, and I am intentionally choosing not to talk about it because I've made peace with it in this way. So I think whatever you can express that this is what I'm doing to help myself, that's kind of the focus that we want to go down. But there's so many different techniques. Again, journaling, finding rituals, sometimes just creating like a memory scrapbook if that's what you want, or talking to people, being able to just have that conversation.
And speaking of talking to people, I think the dilemma of our time is that talking to people has never been easier. Connecting with people is at the tip of your fingers, as they say. But yet we are disconnected. So do you think technology has rapidly skewed people's, behaviors and their ability to communicate with each other?
That is such a good question. I have this love-hate relationship, I think, with technology and social media. On the one hand, I think it's fantastic because it does give us access to information, right? And we can find out, like, what is it that I'm feeling? We can also feel not so alone if we find somebody else who's grieving and see what worked for them. So it gives us that type of connection. And at the same time, it gives us the distraction, right? Like if I'm just getting lost into my scrolling. And the biggest thing is if you find that you're following people who have unhealthy ways of grieving, and then you kind of go down that trajectory. So I think that can be quite harmful. Also misinformation, because there are people who will post things like rage bait or just misinformation for their own purposes. It's not about helping you cope with your grief. It's for whatever ulterior motive they have. So it's about being mindful. Ultimately, we have to work mindfully to figure out how to grieve in a way that's healthy for us.
I think that's a really beautiful point. And I agree with you about the love-hate thing with social media in general. Because as you said, Abdullah, in some ways you can connect very easily, but actually makes us more alone in a lot of ways. And that brings me back to what we were talking about community and stuff like that. You were mentioning that it's hard to talk to people about it, but I think that's also something that's kind of like a stigma for men and women, at least. Because I feel like for women, it's really normal for us to talk about our feelings with our friends, with our sisters, with our mothers. It's kind of how we're raised to be. But men are raised in the complete opposite way. They're raised not to talk about their feelings, not to address them, just put on that stiff upper lip, be a man, don't be weak. So do you have any advice for men who might feel like grief makes them weak when actually it's something they need to deal with and address?
Yes, I would say that the first thing is for them to actually take a look at why they're holding on to that definition of showing emotions. Where did they learn that definition from? And particularly as we grow older, asking themselves, do I believe in this? When we're young, we're socialized to believe certain things, and that's okay. But at a certain point, I think it's very empowering for us to take a step back and say, okay, am I doing this ritual because I was taught it? Or am I doing this because I now believe in it and it's something that I can feel authentic about when I'm doing it? And I think it can also be helpful when we allow men to speak in safe spaces. And sometimes it's just one friend that can make a difference. If you want to start with a friend, therapist is always a good idea because they're a non-judgmental, safe outsider, where you can just kind of emotionally dump on them and they can handle it. But ultimately, I think it's about starting small. So if you're not ready to talk about sadness, start talking about your happiness and see how that feels. And then you can talk about a fear, maybe. Like, oh, this is something that I'm afraid of. So find topics that you are comfortable talking about before you jump into the very difficult ones. That way you develop a bit of a connection with your own emotions, and also you can gauge the room. Maybe you'll have some friends who are not ready to handle any of your emotions. Okay, they're not the ones for you. But you may find someone who is ready to listen and also ready to share. And I think that kind of experimentation can be very helpful.
Yeah. And speaking of, helpful kind of things, you are in a very helpful field. And so from working in this field and from your experience in working in this field for so many years, what has that taught you about, the human resilience or the human spirit or people in general?
I am in awe of human resilience because sometimes when I take a step back and look at the state of the world, whatever angle you want to look at it, I feel like maybe there's no reason for any of us to get out of bed. But we do get out of bed because I think there's something more. And when we find that within ourselves, it's especially powerful, I think, when I see someone, I've been working with them for, let's say, a year or two, and then in year 3, the light bulb goes off.
Oh,
And it's amazing. It takes that long sometimes. Sometimes it's from session 1, but sometimes it takes years. And the fact that they keep showing up for themselves and having difficult conversations, facing that discomfort, I find that to be a really strong sign of resilience. And people are doing it all the time.
I think that's amazing. And before we wrap things up, I want to ask you, what advice would you have for listeners or viewers in terms of dealing with grief? Like, what's one piece of advice you would like to leave them with?
I would say, first of all, acknowledge your grief. Don't be afraid to say it, even if it's out loud to yourself. And then take your time with it. There's no rush. So just be mindful of how it's affecting you. So if it does come up with like physical sensations, then, deal with your physical health first. But other than that, take your time. There's no wrong way to grieve. And, grief is because we've lost something that we love. So honor that love and honor yourself.
I do love how the emphasis of this episode was, in terms of dealing with grief, is to openly face it. And I do love how it's something that's not being talked a lot, but we had the pleasure of talking about it today on the Untold. With that being said, I do want to thank you, Doctor, again and again for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It was our pleasure too. I think we learned a lot, and I think the viewers also got to learn a lot. And with that, we're going on a short break.
Well, that was all from us, the team of The Untold. Another brilliant episode, Dr. Ayesha, Kamal. I really loved how the emphasis of this episode was to deal with grief, to instead of moving on, healing from it by actually facing it, by understanding it, by talking about it.
Me too. And I love that she managed to tell us that what grief is not just losing someone you love physically. It could be a totally different range of things, from divorce to losing a friendship to moving countries, losing a job. The way that we process emotions as humans is very different for everybody, and the range with which we feel grief or sadness or any difficult emotion isn't something to be taken for granted, or just to assume that because you feel this way, someone else is not going to feel it in a different way. And I love the approach that she has for it.
Very well said, Lujain. I really can't add more to that because you've put it such eloquently. But with that being said, that's it from us, the team of The Untold. Until the next episode, goodbye for now.
Goodbye, and see you next time.